An amazing week. Today we're continuing our journey through Ecclesiastes. We've been in this book for 12 weeks now. And this is one of those books, like many other books in the scriptures, that we get challenged a lot in our faith. We get challenged for how we see life, for how we see God. And sometimes we get challenged in that way by hearing something that's hard to hear. That was last week, right? Many of you here were here last week, and the challenge was that Solomon talked about death the entire time, right? And he talked about how it is a common destiny, meaning it will overtake all of us, the good and the evil. None of us are exempt from that common destiny, from death. And that's always hard to hear because regardless of what we attempt to do in this life, there's no stopping it. There's no stopping that appointed time. I shared a quote from a video I heard, and it was an inspirational video about being healthy, and it showed this guy cooking healthy food, and it said, if you want to live, did you know that if you choose to live healthier, you'll die healthier? In other words, there's no stopping it. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole recap of what we talked about last week because honestly, hearing those points is hard enough to hear once. You can go review your notes. You can go look at on YouTube and watch it again if you'd like. But I do want to remind you of how we finished off last week. The way we finished off was we looked at everything Solomon said in the scriptures through the lens of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because Solomon talked about death as if it is bad news. But because of Jesus Christ, the gospel turns death into good news. Why? Solomon was talking like death was the end. He's pretty much saying, hey, enjoy your life because you're going to the realm of the dead where nothing happens. But we know this about the gospel, that Jesus conquered death. So death doesn't have the final say for us. Death is just the doorway into heaven. And it's not that nothing happens after death. Something happens is we become whole, we become perfect, and we worship God forever. So that was the big thing I wanted you to remember from last week, was looking at it through the lens of the gospel, because death is not the end. Today we're going to still be in chapter 9, but we're going to work through the beginning of chapter 10. We're going to start in chapter 9, verse 13, and we're going to work through chapter 10, verse 3. So if you will, stand with me for the reading of God's word. Chapter 9, 13. He says this, I also saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. But nobody remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are no longer heeded. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of the ruler of a fool. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. As dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. The heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. You may be seated. So today we're talking about something way more pleasant than we talked about last week, right? We're not talking about death today, and praise God, right? None of us want to come to church and hear about that 2 weeks in a row. But today we're talking about what is called wisdom. And before we dive into what we're learning about this situation that Solomon describes, we need to understand what wisdom really means. Wisdom is defined as this. It's the wit and cleverness, or even shrewdness. So it's all three of those. When you think of wit, when someone is witty, it means that they're smart and intelligent. But not just that, they're smart and intelligent in the way that they express themselves. So it's not about being smart. It's about expressing yourself in a smart way. And then you have cleverness. Cleverness means that someone has the ability to learn something quickly. And this also doesn't stop there. When someone is clever, that they not only learn quickly, but they're able to apply what they've learned through life skills. That's what cleverness is. And then you have what is called shrewdness, or being shrewd. So someone who is shrewd, it means that they're able to work a situation for personal gain. So think about when Jesus commanded us, he said, I'm sending you out in the dark world. And he says, be gentle as doves and be shrewd as snakes. The word shrewd. Shrewd is a snake. Think about the snake in the garden. When the snake was in the garden, he worked the situation for his personal gain. What did he do? He used words and manipulated Eve to fall, to sin. That's what it's like to be shrewd, is to have a purpose and you're able to twist and manipulate the situation for the purpose, right? That sometimes that sounds bad if you're using it for bad things, but if you're using it for God's kingdom, then that's how you win souls and things of that nature. So wisdom is all of these things. It's wit, it's cleverness, it's shrewd, all summed up into one person when someone is wise. And that's what Solomon saw in this verse today. He says he saw a wisdom that greatly impressed him. Look at what happens in verse 14. He gives us this situation. He says, there was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built huge siege works against it. So let's not breeze past these verses. Sometimes when things are described in this way, we just breeze through them and go to the next one. But always remember, God's given us an imagination for a reason. So let's imagine what this must have been like, right? We're not used to hearing about kings here in our country, but let's think of a modern day king like King Charles III right now. He's the king over the United Kingdom. Picture him in all of his might and all of his power and glory surrounding a town like ours, little old Monahans. Now, here's the thing. The town that we're in right now is probably bigger than the town that is described in this verse. Why? Because it says there were few people in this town, right? So it's probably extremely small. So picture us being surrounded by a king, a powerful king, and he's not here to check our town out. He's not here as a tourist to see what it's like. He's here to come against our town. That is the situation. And we know this not only because the scriptures say he came against the town, but when he surrounded the town, it says that he started building huge siege works against it. So what this is equipment that's used in warfare. So more than likely when they surrounded the town, the soldiers started building trenches around the town. But before they did that, they built a wall to protect them while they built the trenches. And then they built things like battering rams, and they built catapults. And then they had also things that were called siege towers, which were tall towers that were multiple stories tall, and they would roll them up or walk them up to the wall that surrounded the city, lean it against the wall to climb over. So this powerful king that has surrounded this town, he's getting ready to invade it, to take it completely over. That's the situation this small town is facing. And look at what else Solomon noticed next in verse 15. He says, now there lived in that city a man poor but wise. Now, before we get into what this man actually did, let's think about the way he's described. Because several weeks ago, we talked about riches and wealth. We talked about the fact that it's okay to be rich and wealthy. That there's nothing wrong with having lots of money. But it is wrong to try to find satisfaction in it because we'll never be satisfied. Now, think about this. For most of us, when we think about someone being wealthy or rich, we usually think of wisdom, right? And to an extent, it does take some sort of wisdom to increase wealth and riches. Why? Because you have to know what you're doing with your money. But this man that's described today, he's not described as rich. He just is described as poor. And what does it say about him? It says he was a poor man, but he was wise. You see, I want us to remember this, that our wisdom has nothing to do with how wealthy someone is. We don't have to have lots of money or assets or possessions to be wise. We can be wise without all of these things, just like this man is described in the scriptures. He probably doesn't have much at all, yet he is still wise. And look at what he does with this wisdom. Look at verse 15 again. It says, now there lived in that city a man poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom. Now, this is powerful. You have a powerful king surrounding a little town with few people in it. And this poor man saves this city. It wasn't the mighty that saved this city. It was the poor wise men. He saved it through his wisdom. So think about this. When this king first showed up, he showed up with his glory, with his might, with his power. And he was coming against this town. And he was probably thinking that he was going to take over this little town. So technically, who started the war? It was the king. It was the powerful. But I want us to remember this. This is on your notes. Power may start the war, but wisdom wins the war. And here's why. Because what is the point in being powerful if you don't have the wisdom to strategize with your power? What is the point of being powerful if you aren't clever enough to make the right decisions? What's the point of being mighty if you can't even outsmart your opponent? You see, so when you really think about this, power really isn't all that powerful in the hands of someone who is foolish. Because this man just lost this battle because of this wise man. So he rescued it. He rescued it through wisdom. And we're going to talk more about wisdom here in a few minutes. But look at what is said about this man in verse 15. It says, but nobody remembered that poor man. So this poor man who is wise just saved all of his family and friends, whoever was in that town, from being overtaken from this powerful king. And nobody remembered him. Would you consider this man a hero? I think all of us would say yes. Because a hero is someone who is brave, who achieves something that seems unachievable. So think about how terrified everyone must have been in this town. You're surrounded by a powerful king. You're a small town. Most people probably thought it was over. They were afraid. I'm sure this poor wise man was afraid as well, but he did it anyways. And he's a hero. But nobody remembers him. You see, this is the perspective that God wants us to have from this. We all want to be heroes too, and there's nothing wrong with that. We want to achieve the unachievable. We want to be brave when everyone else is afraid, right? We want to be able to do all of these things. But here's where we get sideways with this desire. Is sometimes we want to be heroes, and it has nothing to do with us being heroes, and it has more to do with us knowing that people think that we're heroes. Sometimes we want to do something heroic because it feels good to think about us doing something heroic. Some of us want to be a hero, and that thought or desire isn't about being one. It's about being known. It's about us knowing that other people know that we're heroes. But when you think about what a true hero is, it's not about being popular. It's not about getting attention. It's not about being known. It's not even about being remembered. It's simply about doing the right thing, doing the brave thing, achieving something for the benefit of others. That's what this poor wise man did. Because true heroes are selfless. I mean, just put yourself in this poor man's shoes for a moment. If your town was surrounded by a powerful king and you had nothing, you're poor, but you're wise, and you step up to the plate and you use your wisdom to rescue the whole town, to save the city, would you be okay with going back to having nothing and to being a nobody after you did that? Because that's what this poor man did. He stepped up to the plate, he saved his whole city, and everyone forgot about him. Would we expect something in return for our heroic acts? You see, a lot of us would, and we can understand why. We would say, look at what we did. Look at what we were facing. And I did what I had to do, and we saved the city. See, I don't know what's ahead for all of us. I don't know what God has called us to in the future. But I strongly believe that with this many people here, there's going to be someone that is called to do something that is brave, called to do something that most people don't want to do, called to do something that may seem unachievable to many people. And I want us to learn, if you're called to something heroic in the future, I want you to remember this man's story, because think about this. How many thousands of years ago did this happen? This was before Jesus was born. Thousands and thousands of years ago, this man saved the city, and they forgot him thousands of years ago. But here we are thousands and thousands of years later, and we're still talking about this man, about what he did. But here's the thing. We don't know his name. We don't know if he was married. if he had kids, who he was, but we know what he did. And I want us to remember this. When God calls you to do something heroic, your name might not carry throughout history, but the impact of your actions can. And hundreds of years from now, they may tell a story about you, and it's not about your esteem or how popular or even your name, but the fact that you impacted your society now can impact society 100 years from now. Because here we are probably 4,000 years from this event, and we're still talking about this poor wise man. You see, what really this should show to us, all this whole story, is how extremely important it is to have wisdom. This should speak volumes to us about how big of a deal wisdom is, because that's what Solomon noticed. That's why he wrote verse 16. He says this, wisdom is better than strength. Wisdom is better than strength. Just think about strength. We all desire strength, especially if we're going to live in this life. We all know we need to be strong as we live in this life. Especially if we're going to live as Christians in this life. We're not going to be very good disciples if we don't have strength. So what do? We ask God for strength. We ask God, we say, God, make us strong so we can be the people that you've called us to be. Make us strong so we can do the things that you've called us to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with us asking to be strong. And when you think about it, when we receive that strength, sometimes we think about it like this. When we're strong, we feel mighty. We feel confident. We can stand upright. We can walk with our chest out a little bit because we feel strong. And that may be the case sometimes. That when God gives us strength, we feel mighty and powerful. And you may know someone like that in your life who's mighty and powerful. But here's the biggest question. Are they wise? Do they have wisdom? Because what's the point of being strong and mighty but not wise? What's the point of having all this potential and all of this power and all of this ability to do something, but we're not wise enough to use it? And it wasn't just in chapter 9 that Solomon realized this. He realized this in Ecclesiastes 7 as well. Look at what he said in verse 19. He said, wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Wisdom is better than strength. See, and here's what we need to understand today. The reason we ask for strength and might and power most of the time is because we want to make an impact. We want to make an impact for God's kingdom. We want to impact the world. But our tendency is to think that only mighty people can make a mighty impact. Even with pastors, they think the pastors have to be mighty and big and famous to make an impact. Or we think that about churches, that churches have to be these big, mighty churches to make an impact for God's kingdom. But when you think about how impactful wisdom really is that the one who won the war wasn't the mighty and powerful. It was the poor but wise. I want us to remember this. This is on your notes. A wise person is more impactful than a strong one. And this goes against what we usually think about when we think about strength. We think strength always wins. We think the stronger we are, the more impact we'll make. But a wise person is more impactful than a strong one. I mean, let's just think about this. Think about the impact that Christ made. How did he make the impact in the world? Of course, because he was God in the flesh, right? But still, even then, how did God in the flesh make an impact in the world? Because he was God in the flesh. That means he had the power of the universe at his fingertips. That's why when they arrested him to kill him, he said, I could have angels right here, right now to save me. So even though he had the ultimate power at his fingertips, how did he make the impact? Was it by surrounding cities and building battering rams and siege towers? Was it intimidation? Was it weapons of warfare? No, he didn't do any of those things. Jesus made the impact through his wisdom. He spoke the truth of God. He thought about how he spoke it, when he spoke it, who he spoke it to. He wasn't aggressive the way the world thought he was going to be aggressive. right? People thought he was going to come in with a big old army to take over the Roman Empire, and that's not what he did. But think about the impact that he made, because Jesus Christ, with no social media, no technology, no weapons of war, no army, no might, according to the world standard of might, and he is still taking over the world today. There are places in other countries that people don't have access. They can't even read the Bible, even if they had one. And Jesus is visiting them in dreams. And they're converting over to Christianity at the expense of their life, literally. Because he's still taking over the world. Right? And he did it. He made the impact through wisdom. That is how important wisdom is. That it can make one man stronger than 10 rulers of a city. That it can have one poor but wise man defeat a powerful king trying to overtake a town. You see, we're getting perspective on wisdom today. Look, and we're not done. Look at verse 17. It says, the quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Now there's a contrast here. We're not only talking about wisdom. The contrast is the quiet words of the wise versus the loud shouts of a fool. This reminds me of these videos we've seen before, right? There's about to be an altercation. They're getting into it. You have one person who is super loud, super arrogant, prideful. They use loud words. Their volume is loud. And then you have another person who's calm, cool, and collected. What usually happens, the altercation doesn't last very long, and it's usually the quiet one that won. And what do we say in those situations? You got to watch the quiet ones. They know what they're doing. It's usually not the loud, proud shouts of the fool. It's usually the one that's in the background, calm, cool, and collected, that's going to do some damage. Right? That's what this verse is telling us in verse 17, that the quiet words of the wise are to be more heeded than the shouts of a fool. Because the foolish, they feel like they have to shout to elevate themselves. And they think if they shout and they elevate themselves, it'll make them known. You see, to a fool, wisdom is a threat. So they shout and they boast about what they can do. Fools shout about what they plan on doing. Fools think that if they elevate their voice, they elevate their power and their importance. But the wise don't have to shout. Think about this. The foolish have something to prove, but the wise, those who have wisdom, they're content with proving nothing. They don't have to yell from the mountaintops about what they will do. They just wait and they'll know what to do. They'll know when to do it, and they'll know how to do it. That's how this poor wise man saved this city. He didn't boast about what he could do. He just sat back and waited for the opportunity to do it. You see, that's the difference between the wise and the foolish. The foolish need to be heard, but the wise know that their actions speak louder than their words. You see, this is a great perspective that we're getting on wisdom versus foolishness. Look at verse 18. He says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Now here's another contrast. The difference is between weapons of war and wisdom. The goal of wisdom isn't necessarily to tear down, it's to build up. But weapons of warfare are only designed for one thing, is to destroy. So the sinner or the foolish, they destroy like weapons of war, but wisdom is something that doesn't destroy. It's ready to destroy, but oftentimes is ready to build up. You see, wisdom will take the smallest route of destruction during a time of war, while the fool with weapons of war will destroy everything in sight. That's the difference between wisdom and foolishness. Now think about how weighty wisdom is. It's extremely weighty. Because we've gone through this story and this man has saved this town from this powerful king. But one thing we can't make the mistake of is thinking that there's not weight to our foolishness as well. Now Solomon's going to give us that advice in chapter 10. Look at what he says. He says, as dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly or foolishness outweighs wisdom and honor. This is a great analogy he gives us to understand this. He's telling us how foolishness affects our wisdom. He says a little folly outweighs wisdom, like some flies will make perfume smell. So think of it like this, and this is going to be gross, okay? Think back to your junior high and high school locker rooms. Okay, there was a mistake that was made. Sometimes people wouldn't shower, and what they would do is just spray Axe or cologne. And it doesn't get rid of the stench. It just smells like stinky flowers, right? Like that you can't even really explain it. Or think about your trash cans at home. If you don't throw the trash, it'll start to stink. What can you do? You can spray freshener. You can spray Febreze if you want. But if you do that, all it's going to do is smell like Febreze covered sardines. Now, that's the nastiest thing I could think of, or the best way to describe it. Right? But that's the picture that we're getting here. That's what happens if we think that we can sprinkle a little bit of wisdom on top of our foolishness and it's going to cover it up. Because it's not going to. There's no way to cover up our foolishness. This is your next takeaway on your notes. Wisdom can never hide my foolishness. You see, there's a lot of weight to wisdom, a lot of good weight, but foolishness has weight of its own. And that's the weight. That even if it's small, like the flies in perfume, it can still give a stench to our wisdom when we have foolishness. And Solomon's not done. Look at what he says about this in verse 2 and 3. He says, the heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. Now we're getting more knowledge about wisdom and foolishness. You see, verse 2 is very interesting. He says that the heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool inclines to the left. So in biblical times, they viewed the right hand, they viewed their hands in certain ways. So the right hand was the good and the left hand was the evil. So the right hand was also viewed as prosperity and blessings, while the foolish was to the left, which meant even spiritual incompetence. And something to keep in mind about this verse, it doesn't say that the person goes to the right or to the left. It says that the heart of the person inclines to the right or to the left. So the heart, it's our heart that inclines to wisdom or foolishness. And it makes sense because God's word says that we should protect our hearts because everything comes from it. So whether our heart is full of foolishness or wisdom will determine where our lives are headed, down the right way or the left way, down the blessings or the poor, down the wisdom or the foolishness. And one thing to notice, that verse we just covered, it says that the fools walk down the road with no sense. This should be one of the many reasons why we fight to be foolish, to not be foolish. Because it says that as these people, the foolish, they walk down the road with no sense, that they make their foolishness known to everyone. So, in other words, foolishness will not only lead us down the wrong path, but it will do it in such a way that everyone will know it. We cannot keep our folly or our foolishness private. It will be known, and people will see it. You see, wisdom is a big deal. And that's what God is telling us today, that he wants us to be wise. God expects us to be wise. If you are a Christian today and you live for God, you are called to wisdom. And none of us can say, well, I don't feel like I'm very smart or clever or witty or all of these things. I feel like my brain doesn't operate that way. God doesn't expect everyone to be wise except for a few. He expects all of us to be wise, to walk in wisdom, to not walk in foolishness. But here's a good question. How do you become wise? How do you get wisdom? We're all called to it, but how do we get it? Is it through knowledge? Is the way to wisdom just, you know what? Go read more books. Go study more. Go listen to more TikToks or more YouTube pastors, whatever the case may be. Go and learn more. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's what you would call head knowledge, not wisdom. Because we all know this. We all know that there are some smart fools out there. Now, when I say fools, I'm not talking about the slang I use with my son, like when I'm like, hey, fool, go get in the shower. I'm talking about foolishness. There are people who are brilliant, but make the dumbest decisions. Oh, I mean, we all make dumb decisions, but over and over. It's some people you look at and you're like, you're so smart. You do have it all together up here. You know a whole bunch of stuff, but the path that you choose to go down in life makes no sense. That's what you call smart fools. You see, gaining knowledge is not the way to true wisdom, because knowledge is about knowing things. But wisdom is about knowing what to do with the things that you know. You see, knowledge will just want to argue, but wisdom wants to edify. You see, knowledge wants to just prove a point. And wisdom proves points too, but so you can win the person, not just win the point. You see, knowledge says it's about me because I know a lot, but wisdom understands that it's not about me, even though I know a lot. Knowledge is having a whole lot to say, but wisdom is knowing how to say it, when to say it, or even to say it at all. You see, God's word says that knowledge puffs up. Knowledge is loud and proud. But wisdom is quiet and humble. You see, so it's not just about going and studying as much as you possibly can. So how do we become wise? What's the journey to becoming wise? Here's one of the very first steps. This is Proverbs chapter 9. Solomon wrote this as well. He says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The very start to wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Let me say it this way. You cannot be wise if you don't fear God. You cannot be wise if you don't fear God, and here's why. Because to fear God means you have reverence and respect for him. Think of it like this. To fear God means to understand that God is mighty and we're not. This is the simplest way to put it. To fear God means to know that he is big and we are little. He is everything and we are nothing. And that always leads to wisdom. You know why? Because we hardly ever go to people for wisdom when we think we're better than them. That's just our human nature. No matter what it is in life, when we look for wisdom from someone, from advice, knowledge, whatever the case may be, we're looking at people who have been down the journey further than us. In other words, more experienced, better off, all of those things. But to the person, it's just, we're not doing this in an arrogant way, but our tendency as humans is if we think someone is lower than us, we're probably not going to go to them for wisdom because we think we know better. As Christians, we learn from everyone, right? But especially God. And when we understand that he is mighty and we are not, he is big and we are small, when we fully understand who he is, that's where it's going to lead to wisdom, because we're going to be humbled enough to listen to him. Here's another way. Look at Proverbs 13. Walk with the wise and become wise. Why? For a companion of fools suffers harm. You see, your wisdom depends on who you surround yourself with. Yes, we are called to be spiritual influences in other people's lives, to win people over to the faith. But that does not mean that we surround each other with fools constantly. You see, we can't think that we're so strong in our faith that we can surround ourselves by fools and think that we're going to influence them, but they're not going to influence us. That's why the writer of Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, he says, bad company corrupts good character. You see, by nature, we lean to foolishness. The scriptures tell us that foolishness is born in the heart of a child. We were born with foolishness. So we cannot think that if we surround ourselves with foolishness, that it's not going to entertain our flesh to go back to foolishness, because it will. This is your next takeaway on your notes. We can't expect to be a companion of fools and become wise. So it's fearing God And it's who you surround yourself with. You see, if we surround ourselves with fools and expect to become wise, that's like eating junk food and expecting to lose weight. That's like taking drugs and expecting to pass a drug test. That's like touching fire and expecting not to get burned. We cannot surround ourselves with fools and expect to be wise. Now, some of you, you've heard this message and you feel like you're not wise. Like if I were to ask you, are you wise? Do you have wisdom? I think to a certain degree, every single one of us would say no, because we're not as wise as we'd like to be, which is a good thing, because the scriptures say that the person who is wise in their own eyes, there's more hope for a fool than for that person. So thank God that we all say yes to needing more wisdom. Right? But you heard this. Maybe some of you went the opposite. You don't think that you're wiser than you really are. You think that you're not wise at all. You're like, I want to be everything that God is telling me today, but I am so far from it. You're like, I'm not wise. I want to be, but I'm not at all. I want you to know that that's a good thing. It may not feel good to get to church today and be like, you know what? I'm not a wise person. I don't have wisdom. You know why that's a good thing? Because that's the only way to grow in our faith, is to self-reflect and see what we need to work on. It kind of reminds me of bodybuilding, right? Many people think that the mirror for bodybuilding is for vanity, right? To see how good someone looks. But true bodybuilders, the point of the mirror is for them to look in the mirror and see where they lack, not where they look good. They look in the mirror to see what they don't like about themselves and where they're lacking, so they can adjust their workouts to improve on their flaws. That's the point of the mirror in bodybuilding. That's the point of the Word of God today. If you feel like you're like, man, I feel like I lean more to the full side than to being wise. That is a good and positive thought, because that is how God's going to grow us into becoming wise, is teaching us where we need to work on. You see, it's self-reflection, but let me tell you, thinking about who you surround yourself with, thinking about fearing God, thinking about the impact that wisdom has, that wisdom is better than strength. Sometimes we can overcomplicate things and we can think, well, but still, how do I get it? Look at James chapter 1. If this is the half-brother of Jesus, he writes this: if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. See, here's what I want us to understand about this word wisdom here versus the word wisdom that we covered today. The word wisdom that this man had that saved his town was human wisdom. In other words, it's limited by our human nature. But the wisdom that James is writing about is God's wisdom. It's a wisdom that he can give you beyond what you thought you were ever capable of. And he says, all you have to do is ask. Think about this. Why would God expect you to be wise and then withhold wisdom from you when you would ask him for it? God is here to help us. He's here to equip us. He's here to help us live this life that glorifies him. So when we ask him for help, especially when we ask him for wisdom, he will give it to you. Right? At the beginning of this book, we went through Ecclesiastes. Right at the beginning, I reminded you that King Solomon, when he became king, he didn't ask God for more power. He didn't ask God for money. He didn't ask God for his enemies to fall or more land or more possessions. He asked God for wisdom. And because he asked God not for more power, but for wisdom, God blessed him with the most wisdom that anyone has ever had other than Christ. So let me tell you that you can ask God for wisdom, but make sure that you fear him. And when you ask him for wisdom and he starts to give it to you, don't be surprised when you start to really think about who you're surrounding yourself with in life. And then always remember this same wisdom is described in 1 Corinthians 12 as a gift of the Spirit. So when God blesses you with wisdom like he's going to, remind yourself that it's to stay humble, not to get prideful. Because in the same verse, the Apostle Paul says, what do you have that you did not receive? And since you did receive it, why do you boast and walk around as though you did not? You see, God is calling us to be wise, But always remember the goal. The goal is not wisdom. The goal is to glorify God. But the more wisdom we have, the more we live a life that glorifies God. Because we're not to be puffed up. We're not to say, look at how wise I am versus my neighbor or versus this person. We're simply going to let our actions glorify the Father, to glorify Jesus, because we're wise enough to make the best actions we can possibly make. We're going to go into our reflection time. If this is your